how does your training program look? Really, when it comes down to it, there's only a handful of factors that you need, or principles that you need to include into your training program to make it a really successful one. So if you're interested in finding out what those factors are, stick around for the rest of the video and I'll let you know exactly what you need to be incorporating into your training program to make it the best possible program you can for your performance. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Nick here. Everything sports science and the science of endurance is what we're talking. And there's a few things I want to go through today in regards to making the best training program you can, because it really does come back to some very basic key principles that if you apply really well, you can end up with a really successful training program overall. So it all starts with this overarching principle of specificity. What is our goal? And how are we going to specifically train and specifically tailor all of our sessions, our progress towards that end goal? So if we're going to be a 70.3 triathlete, for example, we obviously need a mix of some reasonably high intensity training because we obviously want to hold quite a high intensity pace throughout the race. But we also need to mix in some volume training as well from a lower intensity perspective to balance the fact that we need to be going hard and fast, but we also need to sustain it for 3, 4, 5 hours, maybe even 6 hours at a time. Shifting then our focus, if we go to a shorter event like a half marathon or a marathon, for example, obviously it's a lot shorter in duration, so we may not have as much emphasis on the volume. We may have a bit more emphasis on the high intensity, and even shorter events again focuses more to that high intensity end of the spectrum. Go the opposite, we go to Ironman, flips the other side, and you get where I'm going with this here. But specificity also then leads to, all right, what's the type of training we need to be doing? If you're a runner and aiming for a half marathon, going out and doing sessions on the bike may be useful in terms of some cross training here and there, getting off the legs, deloading some of the impact, but it's not going to be the most specific training for you. If you're going to be a runner, what do you need to do? You need to run. So that's a key part of the process that we need to nail down on. If you're a triathlete, obviously you're adding in some swim, bike, and run. Specificity of adding in some quality S&C and strength conditioning gym work is also going to be critical, but then targeting the specific needs that you have. If you're a cyclist or a runner, for example, doing lots of upper body work in the gym isn't necessarily going to be a key consideration. But if you're a triathlete that needs to swim and you want to be stronger in the swim because you want a stronger pull or a stronger catch, maybe doing some upper body pulling exercises to work on the lats, etc., strengthen up the shoulders if you constantly get shoulder injuries from swimming. All of these things might be more specific. So really the principle of specificity is just identifying where do we need to get to, and then finding the most direct path to get there, and doing the things that are going to match up with that end goal, as specific as you possibly can. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is then we have to consider, all right, what are our frequencies to training? What is our time availability like in the week, in and around work, family commitments, anything else that is in your life and going on outside of just training for an event? Obviously, the luxury of having pro hours, if you can, great. If you are a professional or elite athlete watching this, ideally you can train as much or as little as you like. But for everyone else who can't do that, how many sessions are you practically going to be able to get in that's going to work into the rest of your daily structure without impacting anything from a fatigue and recovery perspective, impacting your ability to actually get up and perform quality sessions, but then also not impacting anything external, so things like your family commitments, work, etc. So the frequency of training is really critical, making sure we get that right in terms of if you're a runner and you can handle 3 training sessions a week because of everything else going on, but then also 3 training sessions a week is enough to get a nice quality stimulus, what we call minimal effective dose, the minimum amount of work to receive the maximum benefit. 3 training sessions a week might be really useful for you. And we have I've worked with some really successful marathon runners before who've run sub 3 hours, who may only run on 3 or 4 training sessions a week. There's other guys on the other end of the spectrum though, who have more time available, may want to train 4 to 5, maybe even 6 times a week. Might work for them because they're able to tolerate that training load, but it may not work for someone else. So working out a combination of what fits in with your lifestyle, what fits in with your goals in terms of what are you trying to train for as well, that specificity question comes back into it, but then also what can you handle from a training load perspective and management of fatigue and recovery is really critical in making sure we get the frequency right. So we have to look at what's specific, how many times a week are we going to train, then we can start to get to the ins and outs of what each of the sessions going to have. Now, from an individual session perspective, there's a few things we have to consider. We have to consider intensity and the duration of sessions. They're the 2 key parts to any training session. How long are we going to do something for, so the duration, and at what intensity are we going to be working at? Now, this is where every coach or every athlete is going to have a different methodology on what types of training they want to do when. And there's no real right or wrong when it comes to this. As long as you eventually get to the end goal and you work along that path of specificity to get to where you need to get to on race day and perform as optimally as you can. How you get there is almost irrelevant. There's a number of different ways you can get to the same outcome, or a number of different paths to the same outcome. So in terms of duration, if we're looking at a minimal effective dose example I used before, what is the minimum we have to do, particularly for time poor athletes? Ideally aiming for about 105, 110% of your estimated race time is a good starting point for your long, slow sessions. So doing enough volume that you're going to have a bit of muscular endurance in the legs just to be able to complete the race in the first place. So you can work in a little bit over distance here. You might work up to or maybe just below the distance, but at a reduced intensity what you might on race day. That'll allow you to actually run for a longer time period. So an example of that, if that was a bit confusing, is if I'm aiming to run an hour and a half for a half marathon, I might go and run it for an hour 45, but a reduced intensity to my race intensity. So I'm still getting the same amount of time accumulated, or if not more time on legs. So that muscular endurance is really working for me, but I'm not necessarily accumulating the same intensity. So I might only cover 18 to 19 kilometers, but in an hour 45 versus on race day, I might do an hour 30 at race intensity, so I actually cover the full 21. Can sort of manipulate it there. Duration also applies to things like high intensity interval training. So what length intervals am I doing? What work to rest ratios, etc. are going to be applicable based on the type of adaptation I'm trying to produce as well. So if we're looking at really, really high intensity work, aiming on improving VO2 max, aerobic power, the functionality of that aerobic system to work at a high rate, we're going to be looking at longer rest periods. So shorter amounts of work because we have to push the intensity up there, but then longer rest periods to be able to maintain the quality of each of those efforts. If we're looking more the threshold type area, maybe we're looking at longer duration intervals, but with shorter recoveries to try and keep as much fatigue in the legs and tolerate that, or increase our ability to tolerate that lactic acid or that fatigue in the legs as we go throughout the session. Looking at specificity, where does that fit in the race plan? That's then up to what the actual goal is. And back on that specificity question, how does it actually link everything together to get to where we need to go? Second part of the individual session idea is the intensity. I mentioned before, if we're going to go and build some muscular endurance, typically it's going to be that longer, slower intensities. If we're looking at improving some of those upper end qualities, working at high intensity, improving our aerobic power VO2 max, or improving our lactate threshold, we're more looking at that moderate to higher intensity end of the spectrum, and depending on how high we go, is going to then dictate the duration, as I said. Number of different ways we can measure intensity: heart rate, pace, speed, wattage, power for running as well is another big one with the foot pods that's starting to come in. It's the type of thing you can basically use anything that's an objective measure of intensity. You could even use something subjective like RPE, so a rating of perceived exertion, like a 4 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 type session, is going to keep you in line with what your goals were. So as long as you set some sort of duration and intensity at the start of the session and you sort of map it out, you can get really, really specific in terms of what you're trying to achieve in each of those sessions and maximize them as best you can. Last couple of things we do need to also consider in a training program, probably the other two key principles, are progressive overload and then reversibility or recovery, adaptation, all sort of bundled into one. So what do I mean by progressive overload? That's being able to build on sessions and work a little bit more and a little bit harder over a progressive period of time. So we gradually increase the amount of work that we're doing, whether that's increasing the number of intervals we do progressively, maybe add on an extra interval to each session, each running session that you're doing each week. But we can only do this so much. We can't progressively overload every single session and just consistently have this increase. Not really ideal anymore because we know more about the body's ability to recover and super compensate. So if we push the body, we stress it, we fatigue the body, we then need recovery to dip down and then actually super compensate and come back up at a higher level of performance. So typically working off a structure of a 3-week cycle or a 4-week cycle where we have a couple of building weeks, so build, deload and recover, build, deload and recover. We get this stepwise progression where you might go up 3, down 1, up 3, down 1. But overall, it slowly accumulates on each other to then get us to a higher level than we were before. So that's really the principle of progressive overload. We can overload things in a number of different ways. It could be a frequency thing. We could increase the number of sessions we're doing a week. We'd increase the duration of work that we're doing in a session, so increase the time we're running for, or increase the number of intervals. We could also increase or manipulate the intensity. We can increase or decrease what the work to rest ratio is like. So if you have been doing 5 minutes on, 2.5 minutes off, maybe you're going to do 5 minutes on, 1.5 minutes off. That's going to change the adaptation or change the stimulus of the session as well. But it's also going to challenge you to a different point. Less recovery is also going to then be harder to hold that same intensity in that effort. So there's a countless number of ways that we could do progressive overload within our program. The last thing we do need to talk about before we wrap up is the reversibility, adaptation, recovery part of the equation. Now, why I bring these all into one part of it, reversibility is just detraining essentially. If we stop doing things and we stop training overall, we can very quickly lose the effects. It comes down to that old saying of use it or lose it essentially. So if we stop our training completely, post-race, really easy to do, lose a bit of motivation, you might take 2 weeks off and do nothing. Very quickly you find out it's really hard to get back to where you were because we've lost a lot of what we've just built in the initial training program leading into that event. So that's reversibility, talking about what are the effects of stopping or reducing our training too much, causing us to actually go backwards. Adaptation and recovery basically link into one. Like I said, we need to have these periods of adaptation and recovery carefully positioned throughout our training program to allow us to bounce back up to a higher level. Because at the end of the day, training isn't the thing that causes adaptation. And this is a really backwards methodology that everyone sort of gets their head around, is that by training, we have this common misconception that if we train more or we train harder, that's going to cause us to recover, or that's going to cause us to adapt more and adapt faster. It's not the case. We actually adapt in recovery. We don't adapt in training. Training is there as a fatiguing stimulus. It's there to stress the body and cause some damage, essentially, where the body's going to come in, repair first of all, but then grow and build on top of that. So basically, we're breaking things down to then rebuild stronger and better. Because at the end of the day, the body doesn't want to go through that process again and feel as damaged and hurt as it was before. Train, we build on that, but then we're going to have some recovery to just rework things, allow the body to recover and settle down, and then we can attack it aggressively again. That's the way we're going to get to optimal performance and actually start to increase performance. So really, they're the key principles overall of successful training programs anyway. And if you can apply those, regardless of how you apply them, as long as you apply them in a way that's going to be specific, you're providing some sort of overload, there is going to be some periods of recovery in there, you're minimizing the reversibility, you've got a good frequency for how much you can train within the week, but then also across the entire training program, you're considering things like duration and intensity in all of your sessions, you're going to have a pretty sort of well-rounded training program. You're going to have also a justification behind the why you're doing that training program. Again, a lot of different methodologies as to how we can go about someone's training, whether that be for a runner, triathlete or cyclist, etc. But how often can athletes or coaches actually explain their thought process? This is just a clear model of decision making that allows you to pick everything that you need to a lot more specifically and get the most out of that training program overall. So if you've got any questions about anything that we've covered here, I know I've sort of raced through it, but they're the really key principles of an effective training program. Feel free to comment below any questions that you do have. If you want any help with your training program, also happy to help as well. So you can send it through or get in contact if you want to go through a review of your training program, so you can tweak some of these principles to make them work more for you. Otherwise, feel free to hit the subscribe button and follow along for some more content coming soon on the science of endurance performance. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.